So the first segment we're going to talk about is science and faith. And I'll be very brief because I know you want to hear about the Shroud. But we have a crisis in America, and I was speaking to my friends in Europe last night, and they said they have the same crisis there. The artificial separation of science and faith. I'm going to demonstrate to you that it's an unnatural separation, and they can't possibly be separated. If you go back in history, science was formerly known as the natural philosophies. And prior to that, it was known as philosophy. As detail and evidence came into vogue in the scientific method, quantification of life became known as the physical sciences. But if you go back in time, there really was no separation. Interestingly, at Mass, during the Gospel, Jesus says, if you do not believe in me, believe at least the miracles. Believe in at least the miracles. And then Father Spitzer said, well, a lot didn't believe, but a lot did. Another interesting thing is that during this time of Easter, we always hear about the apostles abandoning Jesus and Thomas not believing in Jesus, the doubting Thomas. But is that really real? At the Last Supper, they all swore to lay down their lives for this Jesus who they had followed for 3 years. Jesus was their commander-in-chief. He thought he was the new king of Israel, to restore Israel and give them salvation, if you will, from the Roman government. They were all willing to lay down their lives, and they proved it. In the Garden of Gethsemane, they pulled their swords, and they were following their general. And the general suddenly changed the mission in their minds. Jesus didn't change it in his mind, but they thought they were going to have a military coup against the Romans. And if you pull your sword out, that's like pulling your weapon out in the field of battle today. So don't for a minute think that they were cowards. Their general changed the mission on them. Jesus told them, put down your weapons. So they didn't know the whole 3-year mission all of a sudden was changed on them. And this is, I think, very, very important because there's no greater evidence that they were willing to lay down their lives, just as they said at the Last Supper. They actually went out there, and as you know, with military experience, if you pull a gun on someone, they have the right to shoot you too. Why did they become cowards? Because all of a sudden this worldview that they had was changed. Their commander-in-chief gave himself up. So they were mystified. Peter went and followed Jesus, but he still didn't understand all these, and they recognized Peter right away. And then you get the 3 denials, and it's not that that's a story of heroism, but I want to prove that the fact is that night they were willing to lay down their lives. As for Thomas, he wasn't there the first evening of the week. The other apostles were. The other apostles got to see the risen Lord. Thomas didn't. So then we get the doubting Thomas. But remember, all of them needed to see to believe. All of them needed the evidence to believe. When Mary Magdalene told them the tomb was empty, none of them believed. They needed the evidence. So this is something we've come up over the years to try to give you a little bit of better context. We always hear about the cowardice of the apostles, but their whole mission was changed that night when their commander-in-chief said, lay down your weapons. So they didn't understand that point. The crisis in America now is, of course, and throughout the world, is this artificial destruct between faith and science. What is a science? What is science, and what are facts that we accept? Well, if you want to hear more about this, please, we'll come out to the Shroud Center and we'll talk about it. But what is a fact to us medical scientists? A fact is a repeated series of data points that are consistent, that point in a particular direction. And sometimes those data points are voluminous. Sometimes they're overwhelming. But we've all seen in medicine where those facts have changed. We saw it with estrogen when the World Health Initiative study came out. 52 studies said estrogen was a woman's best friend. I took an 8-month sabbatical and I came back and my world had changed. Estrogen is now the enemy. There's many, many examples where we see a fact And think about fact and think about truth. And think about truth with a capital T, which is perfect truth, versus what most of us, when we think we're talking with a capital T truth, we're really talking about a small t truth. We're talking about a fact, which is, again, an aggregation of data points that, though can be very, very supportive and very helpful and get us to the moon and hopefully get us to Mars, those facts we see about every 10 to 30 years change. Okay, so why am I saying this? Because the facts that you use in everyday life, that you depend on, are probably very good facts, but hopefully at the end of this meeting, you're going to see that the facts in support of the authenticity of the shroud usurp the facts we accept. So I don't want you to get rid of the facts that you accept in life, but please quantify what we're trying to say, because at the end, people say, that's a great talk, it's everything, but we know the carbon dating proved it a fake. And so carbon dating is a piece of the puzzle. It is a data point in what I call the data set, but we're going to give you a lot more information. Having said that, I want to preempt the carbon dating question by talking to you about 4 studies that were done by one, a good friend of mine, and one his associate. The shroud's been redated by Giulio Fanti from the University of Padua, published in the most prestigious journals, where he did infrared spectroscopy, Raman spectroscopy, and he did mechanical testing of the fibers, all showing the shroud to be, on average, 90 AD plus or minus 200 years, putting that in the 1st century. Ray Rogers published a paper in Analytica Chemica Acta showing that the vanillin content, which dissipates like carbon-14 dissipates, can be quantifiable to put the shroud also in the 1st century. So we have 4 scientific papers published in the scientific literature that say we got to call into doubt the carbon dating. Interestingly, the dating of the carbon dating test was done at 3 laboratories, 2 of which have called for new testing. 2 of which have called for new testing. And we can talk hours about what happened to the problem. At the last minute, when they were dating the shroud, the church decided you can't take your 10 samples to represent the shroud. You have to take 1 sample in this area, and they said this area, and you're going to cut it in 4 pieces, and they dated 3, and that area has been shown to be the most highly contacted piece. Now, in the old, before all this other data that supports a 1st century date, it was like, well, that's just sour grapes. That's just your opinion. But now, if you look at the 4 dating procedures that I had mentioned, they are just as strong as the carbon dating, and the leading archaeologist involved in the shroud will tell you that in field archaeology, the carbon dating is great, but it's thrown out if all the other data is inconsistent with the carbon dating. By rule, the carbon dating is thrown out if all the other lines of evidence disagree with one piece of evidence, and the archaeologists are supportive of this. The last thing I want to say about faith and science is Father Spitzer mentions this. We're losing, a new statement out by the bishop was that for every 1 Christian coming into the church, and not just the Catholic Church, 6 Christians are leaving, and their number 1 reason is because we know science trumps faith. Well, it's very interesting. Did you know that does not pertain to scientists? Did you know that the people that they are surveying are not scientists? Did you know that the scientists are not leaving the church? They've stayed consistent within 1% over the last 20 years. So the non-scientists are using science as the excuse. We know better, we're more intelligent, we know that we have science, but remember, it's not the scientists that are leaving the faith. There is a majority of Christian theists and deists in the scientific community that are believers in God, either a Christian God or non-Christian God or some transcendental cause for everything. It is a majority of worldwide scientists. The last point, you say, well, what about all the, and it's not 80%, it's only about 53%, but it is a majority. The last point is that if you look, it's always in their surveys, you got to go deeper into your survey. when you survey those scientists that are atheists, almost all of them were atheists before they became scientists. So science didn't change their opinion. I left the church in medical school not because of science. I left it because I wasn't that grounded in my Catholic faith, and I met all these really intelligent people that were from all different faiths or no faith, and I came to the conclusion that we can't all be right. So I respected the fact that I became an agnostic, and I felt that that was well-founded. But what didn't I have? I didn't have science. I didn't have the scientific support. If you know Father Spitzer's website, magicenter.com, his mission is to the millennials that are leaving the church, but he bases it on the proofs of God. So we got brought in with Father Spitzer because even though we're not as grandiose as Father Spitzer's ministry, he's now a very, very firm advocate of the shrouds. So please remember that it's not the scientists that are leaving the faith, it's those non-scientists that are using science as the fulcrum. Same thing happened in the French Revolution in the 1800s. It wasn't the scientists that were separating religion and science. It wasn't the scientists, it was the non-scientists. So it's not to take away from non-scientists. It's just that in the shroud and in science, we need to stay within our area of expertise. I violated that. We all violate it sometimes. When we went to medical school, there was something called Episcopalian authority, and they warned us about it. They said, as a doctor, people are going to listen to you even in areas you're not an expert in, and be careful about that. Well, now where did we go? We went down. Do people give us Episcopalian authority anymore? No, but who gets it? The movie stars, the celebrity. I'm writing a book right now, and I say if they have cash in one hand and a microphone in the other, they have Episcopalian authority. So that's point number one. Now we're at Easter, who we're going to talk about the Passion of the Shroud.
Okay, I'll keep up with you. Just keep going.
So my argument and the closing argument is I believe that there's an inordinate more amount of factual evidence for support of the shroud than what we consider our facts every day. Go home, think about your facts. Think about how much evidence you really have, and then compare it to the evidence on the shroud, and then just put it in proportion. The shroud is the physically most studied object on the planet. It's been studied by NASA, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Dow Chemical, Shroud of Turin research projects, 40 scientists picked by Dr. John Jackson, most of which were atheists. And they went in and thought within 5 minutes they were going to see paint on the shroud, and they didn't. And after 5 days of research, after 100 scientific publications, they concluded that the shroud was not a fake. The forensic evidence, the county coroner of Los Angeles, Bob Buckland, the county coroner of New York City, Fred Zugabe, many pathologists unanimously declare that the image in the shroud is from a body that was in the shroud. It's not the work of an artist, okay? The first stigmata we see on the shroud are flog wounds, and we're going to see them in great detail. You saw them a minute ago, but we weren't pointing them out. Here are these. Look at this little dumbbell-shaped contusion here. They're perfectly dumbbell-shaped contusions all throughout his back, in the nude, from the neck to the ankles, from the front of the body all the way down. And this is an artist's depiction. We have an actual one at the Shroud Center, a first-century Roman flogging device called a flagrum taxillatum. And they made these by the thousands on a mint, and we actually have them there. And these two dumbbell shapes correspond perfectly to these dumbbell shapes on the shroud. Another thing is that under ultraviolet fluorescent photography, every one of these contusions, only under UV fluorescent photography, you see a serum halo around every single contusion on the shroud. Just like the photonegativity, which could never be discovered unless photography was discovered. Who would have thought? Even with a middle-aged carbon date, photography wasn't there. You'll never see that negative, beautiful image without the invention of photography. But we're really not talking about a theoretical forger today. I'm really saying that as medical people, the forensics evidence is unanimous that this is not a painting, that this resulted from a corpse that at the time of putting in the shroud, the corpse was dead and in rigor mortis. Go back one. So here's a computer enhancement of all the scourge marks. This is computer enhanced. Go to the next one. Here's the wounds on the back of the neck. Now, Jesus, as you know, you historians, is the only crucified person in history that received something on his head. We call it a crown of thorns, more like a cap of thorns. I tease a little. They didn't have little crown of thorn shops. They had just a matted mass of thorns, and they pushed it on his head. And we see from the top of his head to the back of his head, we see blood flows in his head. Interestingly, go back one. Interestingly, people were flogged. They were flogged under Jewish law. The famous 40 minus 1 in the Mishnah says 40 minus 1. But Jesus wasn't flogged under Jewish law. He was flogged under Roman law. This is not a Jewish flogging. It is a Roman flogging, which is not limited to 40 minus 1. The evidence on the shroud is this man was flogged not 39 or 40 times, but probably 120 times. Josephus describes the Jewish historian Josephus describes victims that were flogged that got killed by their flogging. They were eviscerated by their flogging. Interestingly, Jesus is the only one in history that we know of that was flogged and crucified. You either get flogged, which can nearly kill you, that's enough, or you're crucified, which is enough. No one was flogged and crucified. Cap of thorns, flogging, and crucified, those three things are unique to the person of Jesus. So here we have Jesus nailed through what's called the space of Desto. It's also known as the palmar furrow. It's here. As most of you know, a nail here would not withstand the weight of the body. It's been shown by Pierre Barbet, the French surgeon. No way was Jesus nailed here. He was nailed through the palmar furrow, separating the carpal bones, not breaking them, stimulating the median nerve, and keeping his thumb in a Dupuytren's contracture, which we'll see later, is the image on the shroud. You'll see Jesus with the man of the shroud with his hands like this, 4 fingers, which used to be considered, that maybe an artist forgot to put thumbs. Another thing they said is his fingers are too long. We'll show you why his fingers are perfectly not too long. As a matter of fact, Greg, what size is your hand glove for surgery?
7.5.
So it's mine. Interesting. His hand is exactly a size 7.5, okay? So the average size for a male hand. So here you see an exit wound in the wrist, if you want to call it that. Here's the exit wound, and the blood, as you know, doesn't flow this way. Blood flows this way. So in the tomb, it's here, but in order for blood to flow vertical, you have to put the arms in a crucifixion position. Next slide, please. Here's the side wound here, side wound here. Father Spitzer mentioned it yesterday on his TV show. We have the actual first century flagrum, but we have a replica of a first century Roman lance, which is the width of this here. And again, this blood is flowing in this direction, so this blood was flowing from his side, 5th intercostal space, during the crucifixion. So, next slide.
Into the image now.
Okay. We also have wounds in the feet. We'll show you a little bit later. So in 1976, John Jackson, who's co-author of 4 papers of ours, he's the head physicist on the shroud. He's the most privileged man in the world as far as I'm concerned, because he alone was given the privilege to study the shroud with his 40 scientists. No one's been given that privilege ever since then. They're the ones that published 100 papers saying that the shroud is not a fake. Can I say what else it is? No, I can't. But I'm going to give you evidence, and hopefully at the end you can draw your own conclusion. But the idea that it's a fake has been, it's 1 in a billion that it's a fake. Some of you guys know this hospital. The chairman of nuclear medicine got together with me many years ago, and we did some nuclear imaging studies. Now the shroud face, if you go back one, there's a lot of contamination. These are the burn marks that go 3-dimensional, but you can ignore those. Those are artifacts. The arms are 3-dimensional, the hands are 3-dimensional, and the face is 3-dimensional, and you'll see it a little bit better. Next slide. So Dr. Ken Lyons, some of you may remember him. He's also was chairman of nuclear imaging. He was also the chief editor of Clinical Nuclear Medicine, the most prestigious nuclear imaging journal. And he did some research with me. So we had 3 subjects. I was one. He injected me with radioactive technetium. The nice thing about a bone scan is the first thing it'll do is it'll saturate your soft tissues. So that's why you get a bone scan and they say come back in 3 hours, because we don't want to look at your soft tissue, we want to look at your bones. But in the shroud, we see soft tissue and bone, so we had to time it. We had to do this many, many times to get the right ratio between soft tissue and bone. So here you see the hands on the shroud here. Notice that, and you'll see a higher definition picture here. Here's the exit wound. You'll see a higher definition image where you can see the fingers more carefully. But notice that these fingers are coming up and then there's a density here. I have arthritis a little bit in my knuckles, but notice this density increases when I take my thumb and I place it under the palm of my hand. Next picture, please. Look at this right here. This is a negative, so it's going to be reversed. Here are the fingers. Looks like these fingers go all the way to your wrist. Your fingers don't go to your wrist. Your fingers go to here, and then you have metacarpal bones. And the shroud is showing the metacarpal bones going to the wrist, and we demonstrated with our nuclear imaging that the thumb, which is not out here, is this image right here, which is right here. In the past, some critics have said, well, his fingers are too long, so the artist messed up. The fingers, when we said size 7.5, if you go from here to here, that hand size in full-size images is exactly size 7.5. Next image. So then we decided the shroud has 3-dimensional imagery, but it's not complete three-dimensional imagery. It only goes about 36 millimeters. It's like a bas relief, or Star Wars, if we're old enough, though, remember Han Solo, he gets frozen, and remember, it's not his full body that you see 3D, it's just a mask-like effect. And so what we did is I don't know how well it shows up back there, it's not showing up here, but here's a 3D image of the face, and hopefully there's a better one there. But what we're getting is the orbits, but if you go back on the lateral aspect of your orbit, it's closed. But here it's open. So the 3D effect is a relief of the face, but the image stopped for some reason about 29 to 36 millimeters. So you get 29 to 36 millimeters of 3-dimensional facial information, and then it stops abruptly, and we'll mention that. So we did multiple scans with Dr. Lyons, and the gamma scanner can give you 6-millimeter slices. So we did 6, and we said that doesn't match, and we did 12, and that doesn't match, and 18, and 24, and 30. And at 30 millimeters, we got a match, and then we talked with Dr. Jackson, who had done many computer simulated models, and we're the only ones who were lucky enough to use real human people. All the research we're going to talk about is not done with human people. So to this day, be proud of Hoag, but we were the only ones who did this, and we published 4 articles, and it's been very, very well received. So that image of the 3D image is about 29 to 36 millimeters. So what about the image on the shroud itself? The image, every theory of image formation, from painting to a vapor coming off a dead body to an ancient photograph, which some have purported. The hardest thing to do is to reproduce the image on the shroud. When you look at the image of the shroud to the fiber level, you see that fibers are discolored. Now, a fiber is about 12 microns. It was originally thought that the image was 4 microns, or about a human hair. Someone losing their hair like me, it's like 4 microns. Some thicker, it's like 6. But it turns out it's not 4 microns, it's 0.2 microns, and it only discolors the outer surface. So painting theories, all theories have been tried and failed. So people said, well, what about radiation? Well, it turns out that we couldn't get it because the radiation would caramelize the fiber. They hit it with CO2 lasers, they hit it with argon lasers, But then they tried something called vacuum ultraviolet radiation. Now the key word here is vacuum. Vacuum ultraviolet radiation only works in a vacuum. So the shroud's not sitting, and do you have a De Lazaro picture? Here's De Lazaro. Here's De Lazaro's fibers. And go back one. And here's shroud fibers. So he reproduced, the only experiment so far that reproduced the chemistry of the shroud fibers as close as possible. Are we saying it's vacuum ultraviolet? No, we're saying vacuum ultraviolet is the closest thing we can get. And the amount of energy required to discolor linen fibers without burning them, caramelizing them, is something in the realm of 30,000 watts. But the pulse duration is so fast, it's an intense radiation in a very short period of time, and most of us have used lasers, and we know you have your pulse duration and your intensity. And you can have a high intensity, but if you have a billionth of a second of a pulse duration, that's the only thing that gave that result. That was one of the key things for Father Spitzer. He was so excited about that he wants to meet Paolo de Lazaro. And he and Giulio Fanti are coming out this summer to meet him. Again, here's a negative image on the shroud. It's kind of granular. If you come to the center, we'll give you more detailed images. But Lee has here God from God, light from light, because vacuum ultraviolet is intense light, and that's the only aspect that will recreate the image. If I have 5 more minutes? Okay, 5 more minutes. The Transfiguration, what was that all about? What was that all about? Well, there's a lot. It was about a lot. But Father Spitzer talked about this yesterday on his program. It was about a lot. But it's interesting, Jesus is transfigured. Read it again. It says his clothes were transfigured. Why were his clothes transfigured? Because when he was transfigured, he lost his density, and the clothes would have just fallen off him. So the clothes, interestingly, are transfigured, okay, with the body. When Jesus is walking across the water, they think they see a ghost. After the resurrection, they keep thinking that they're seeing a ghost. The point being is that after the transfiguration, Peter is walking down with Jesus, and Jesus says, "Do not tell anyone what you've seen until my resurrection." I'm paraphrasing. He said, "Do not tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man is glorified." Well, interestingly, Peter got to see that, but he didn't get to see the resurrection. Nobody got to see the resurrection except the shroud. So the transfiguration is, in most of people's opinion, a glimpse of what would later. And that, therefore, when they saw the image on the shroud, probably they recalled the transfiguration and said, things are starting to make sense here. So is there any more? Next? Is that it? So, okay, do you want to ask a few questions or just conclude?
Any questions, for sure.
Yes.
I saw a documentary by a graphic designer that simulated the whole thing.
Yeah, I think I saw that.
There was that really the body sort of went upwards.
Yeah.
Instead of sitting up. Is that the same theory that you guys described?
Yeah, and I tried to talk, I hope I did an okay job. I tried to keep it, we can talk hours about all of this. There's no evidence. Okay, if you're laying on a shroud, your mechanical force, if you could somehow create an image, your force should create a darker image on the back side than the front side where the shroud's laying on you. We get just the opposite. The shroud is darker on the front side than the back side. The weight of the body, the touching of the cloth, has nothing to do with the body image. Okay, the touching of the cloth, the mechanical stress to the cloth. Another thing I have to mention for the physicians in the group is there's hundreds of blood marks on the shroud. None have been disrupted. When you look at the microscopic aspect of those blood clots, you'd see little fibers coming up where blood, if you try to pull a bandage off your scab, you'd see disruption, very easy to see under macroscopy. None of that is, so there's evidence that the body was in the shroud, but there's no evidence now that the body ever physically, mechanically separated from the shroud. So we say the weight of the body didn't contribute, but really touching the shroud didn't. But can anybody answer, maybe according to what you're saying, is why is the frontal image have greater intensity than the dorsal image where the weight of the body is? Yeah, I don't know if it's yeah. What we think is the body became transparent like the transfiguration. The weight of the cloth in this case did not transfigure. The cloth is still, here in Turin. And that cloth is collapsing through a radiant body. Remember, vacuum ultraviolet only works in a vacuum. So don't think of radiation emitting itself to a cloth. The cloth had to go to the source because vacuum ultraviolet only acts about 3 millimeters. So there's a lot of theology here, but really I hope I covered why I think it's important. The evidence of the shroud really, if you really do your homework, is more, I'm not trying to take away about our facts that we accept. They're very good. Soon they're getting us to Mars. But if you look at the most studied object, I'm not serious, the most studied object on the planet has an enormous amount of more facts. So it makes some people uncomfortable, but in terms of, what we're talking about, especially with everything in the media these days about facts and fake news and opinions and relativism and stuff like that, hopefully we can play a role in society through our medical sciences and other sciences, because all my friends that aren't medical scientists and they're physicists and geneticists and everything, they're all saying we have to take our trade and we have to have a greater cause to take it to help bring back together faith and science. Thank you.